Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called The Gap with Canada Widens. Again, Trump terminates talks with Canada. Wow. Our guest for the show is Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hi, Jay. Lots going on nowadays.
You bet. The deterioration of the U.S. relationship with Canada is tragic and profound and has become long term. We need to follow it closely because it is having and will have significant economic and political effects and geopolitical effects on both the US and Canada. So let me start by asking you about this tax on the internet, on websites. What's the background of that? Why did Canada do that? What did it hope to achieve? And what was the reaction from Trump?
Well, maybe I should step back a bit from that and have why does Trump really have tariffs? And then what are Trump's excuses for tariffs? Because the digital service tax episode is simply one of his excuses. You know, if you stand back and say, why does Trump have tariffs at all? You know, he loves tariffs. Why does he love them? What does he want them for? And the purposes are, in fact, in my mind, are firstly and foremostly, he wants tariffs as a source of U.S. federal government revenue so that he can have a less of a deficit given the big tax breaks to the very wealthy. You know, so it's to help finance the U.S. government. And therefore, if that's one of his main purposes, then you have to build into any thinking on trade with anybody that he wants to have tariffs long term. The second item is he uses the statement he would like to do reshoring of manufacturing to the United States, and he seems to have focused particularly on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. I think those are dumb choices, but that seems to be what he's done. And then, a third thing which has become more relevant lately, and perhaps the Canadian one is a good example of his negotiating tactic is to be a bully if he can be a bully, and if he can wiggle things around and change them every day and look angry the next day and look happy the third day after, that's in order to get some advantage that he can get some concession from the other party that is otherwise not deserved in any logical basis. Now, I think of those as his three reasons for why he really wants tariffs. Now, then you have to say, when you look at the news with regard to his relation with Canada and the trading with Canada, you really get a totally different story. You never hear in Canada that, Trump's reason was to get income to the U.S. government so he could afford a big tax cut. The first big excuse was they would have tariffs because he thought there was too much fentanyl coming from Canada into the United States. Well, then that got expanded a little bit, and it became you needed additional border security. Maybe there's people smuggling something else across the border. Well, those are pretty phony excuses, but he just keeps beating that drum, and that's his excuse for tariffs that week or whatever change he was doing that week in order to get his three underlying advantages. Well, the second, then his main excuses for tariffs then switched, and he jumps back and forth between more than half a dozen excuses, but the fentanyl and border security one seems to have gone somewhat out of out of his focus. Then it was supply management. By supply management, that's in Canada, we have a method for dealing with dairy and and eggs and chicken type of things where the production is regulated. Everybody gets a quota, and therefore the prices are higher for those products than they are in the United States. But we don't have the kind of mess that you now have in your agricultural businesses with overproduction and prices jumping all over the place. Our suppliers have nice steady income, they're reliable, but the public pays a premium for that. Well, then Trump's next excuse for tariffs was to do with automobiles, and that's been one of his favorite things to beat the drum on, is that nobody should be producing any automobiles for sale in the United States except U.S. producers. And then as if naively, Americans should not buy any automobiles unless they're produced in the United States. Now, then he has that same attitude to steel and aluminum, and again, that became another excuse for tariffs against Canada, as, somehow, the aluminum we've been selling to the United States to produce automobiles somehow was an unfair deal to the U.S. and should cease and desist. But that was his excuse for tariffs, as opposed to why he really had the tariffs. Again, I repeat that idea. These are excuses. They're not really bona fide things in my mind. Well, and he uses lumber in the same way. Um, a sixth item that he used for excuses that makes the news in Canada from time to time is that our banking system is we have monopoly type banking or oligopoly in Canada, that we don't allow the Chase Manhattan Bank to open a branch and compete fairly. That attitude. And then the last one was this digital service tax, or basically attacking the Canadian tax system. Well, just to sort of end this idea of excuses for his tariffs as opposed to the real reasons he has the tariffs, but things he mouths about in order to try to, move along with his basic underlying agenda to end up with some baseline tariffs and whatever advantages he can get out of any country whatsoever. The he has made a big bunch of noise about having a reasonably complete deal with the United Kingdom. Well, one of the key things in the United Kingdom is that they have a digital service tax. Exactly the same thing as Canada, as does, about, three-quarters of the countries, but all the major countries in the EU, France, Italy, Spain, and then of course the UK, that's a major European country. They all have this same digital service tax. That is, why should Amazon or Google be able to do business in Canada, make a profit in Canada, pay no tax in Canada? And Canadians would say that doesn't make sense. They should pay some. How do you do that? And the rest of the world seem to have said the way you do that seems to make most sense is a digital service tax. And it has worked for a while in Europe, and Canada was a little slower at getting it into place. And so be it. But again, it's simply an excuse for the tariffs, and obviously in the detailed negotiations with the United Kingdom, it didn't matter. They still have their digital service tax, and the U.S. seems happy with the deal with the United Kingdom. So why would that be any different for Canada? Why is it any less fair or unfair?
When did Canada impose this tax? Was it recently?
It just became effective July 1st. But the United States has known about it for months and months and months. I mean, it could have been brought up any old time. It just happened to be the opportunity for the excuse of the moment.
Oh God, this is so. You've named 7 things, and it seems to me that what you've said is that none of them are really valid arguments. What is his reason then? You mentioned he has his real reason. We don't know what that is. Do you have any guesses about what his real reason is for imposing tariffs?
Oh, yeah, the real reason is to get U.S. government revenue to support the tax cut, to encourage, if possible, reshoring of some manufacturing to the United States. And very importantly, a third reason is to use them as a method to bully people into things that otherwise are unfair or unreasonable.
When he says he wants to raise revenue, and we've talked about this, everyone has talked about this. The tariffs are paid by American consumers. Full stop. They're not paid by these other countries. So when you say he wants to raise revenue, he's raising revenue from American consumers. I mean, how does that help his economy? Sounds like it doesn't at all. You're taking with one hand and giving with the other, and it's a net it's a net penalty to the consumer. And on the other one, reshoring, I don't think reshoring is possible in an interdependent world. You want to make a car, you need parts from everywhere. You want to make anything complex, you need parts from everywhere. So I don't think he's successful about reshoring. I think he's never going to be successful about reshoring. So those two, to me, are non-starters. Do you agree?
I do agree, and that really leads to the important thing is what's the economic status of his effect so far, and what's the outlook like? Where do you carry this forward? And the simplest example, where just following it on what you just said is to think of the steel, aluminum, and automobiles that kind of go together. So if he really thinks there's going to be reshoring, that is, let's not have the NAFTA agreement where some of automobile production or parts, the steel and aluminum come from Canada or Mexico. So if you just said, oh, he just magically gets what he's after, if this is what he's after, you'd have, instead of low priced Mexican labor and lower priced, much lower than the US labor in Canada, and making the end cost of an automobile that's produced between the three countries would be lower. And if you've got Canadian steel and aluminum in there without tariffs, then the end automobile would cost less. Now, if we just carry forward what's the economic effect if Trump ends up with a baseline minimum 10% tariff on anything going into the US, essentially the way it happened with the United Kingdom. He had one exception. They could bring in Rolls Royces and Bentleys, without the 10% tariff, but everything else seemed to have 10% in the British thing. So if you eliminate that, then what you really have done is gifted China the world monopoly on automobiles. If you just take automobiles, steel and aluminum together, the one of the biggest users of steel and aluminum is automobile manufacturing. If you're going to isolate the U.S. market, you're going to increase the price of every automobile produced in the United States by a fairly significant margin compared to what it is today. Then you have to not allow any foreign autos to come in the U.S., but anything produced in the U.S. would not be competitive in any other market. In Canada, we buy a way more U.S. automobiles than the automobile production side of Canada contributes to. That is, the balance of trade in automobile parts between Canada and the U.S. it very, very favors the U.S. So why would you beat us up? It's stupid.
It sounds like the real stupidity here is that if you impose tax, that is tariffs, on products coming into the country, and let's stick with automobiles, then the consumer pays that. So now the automobile from anywhere outside the country is more expensive. Okay, but then if you try to reshore, the labor costs in the U.S. are more expensive. So either way, he's creating a situation where the consumer has to pay substantially more to buy a car. Either way, and of course, the result to me, in my perception of the economics involved, is that additional charge to the consumer, one way or the other, goes for inflation. It's a statement of inflation, and it has a secondary effect, but also that there's less disposable income for other things like eggs and groceries and the cost of living and rent and and gas and what have you. So what he's doing is he's making it harder for the American consumer, no matter what. Have I got that right?
You have exactly right, but you still only have half of the equation. The entire burden is not passed to just the consumer. You have to think of a U.S. industry. If you're a maker of widgets in the United States and you sell your widgets to Europe or Canada or Africa or South America or Japan, all of the costs of your inputs are increased. If he has across the board tariff of 10% on everything coming in, then anything that you use whatsoever to make your product, well, take some simple items like that the U.S. doesn't have. The U.S. doesn't have enough aluminum, enough uranium to support the power plants that you've now got, the nuclear plants. So if you put a 10% tariff on the aluminum or the uranium from Canada or anywhere else, then the cost of all the power in the United States goes up. And so every single industry that makes anything that they want to sell to the American consumer goes up. As you say, the consumer hurts, but I'm giving you that hurts double. But the industry can't sell its product anywhere else as competitively as they used to. And you can take things like potash. So if you eliminate if all the fertilizer for everything produced in the Midwest or anywhere else in the United States costs more, then all of the food that they produce is going to cost more. Well, then you can't sell your soybeans as easily as you used to.
Let's get back to the digital service tax for a minute. His latest gambit. So what I get is that he finally it struck him that there was a digital service tax in Canada, such as in various countries in the EU and Britain. And he went crazy. He got mad. He got angry. It's his thing, and he called Canada nasty. I love when he uses that word. There's nobody nastier than Trump himself, but it's called projection. He calls other people nasty when he is the most nasty guy that we know. Anyway, so now he's all angry and all nasty, and he threatens to terminate trade talks with Canada and increase tariffs. So what kind of a threat is that? What is the state of these trade talks anyway? Is there active negotiation going on? Is it meaningful that he says that he is terminating trade talks? Is it meaningful that he says he's going to increase tariffs? And I suppose that means tariffs for none other than punitive purposes. What does that mean, and how threatening is it to Canada?
The new prime minister of Canada, Mark Carney, is very clever in regard to saying virtually nothing and not allowing any of his ministers or anything to say anything about the status. So if Trump says the status of all trade talks is off, because the latest excuse, the digital service tax. But remember, everybody, that counts knows that the digital service tax that the United Kingdom had remains, and that it's illogical to say that people like Meta or Google should be able to make a bunch of money in Canada and pay no tax in Canada. That's just totally illogical, unreasonable. It is simply Trump's latest excuse to make a bunch of noise, hoping that his noise will extort concessions that otherwise he would not be able to get. Like to me is what I call, why does he have tariffs? Is one of them is his bully tactic to try to arm twist or extort concessions that otherwise you couldn't get, because smaller countries maybe hurt more than the United States does when he plays tough.
What's the threat really mean? Are there active negotiations going on? Could he, would he increase tariffs in some punitive way? Is this meaningful, or is it just, the bullying of the day?
The bullying of the day is, I believe, that at levels below the president and prime minister level, there are negotiations still going on. And I'm sure his subordinates recognize that he throws a monkey wrench into the works with this latest rant and rave. So they will have to salute a little bit and maybe delay some of the chatting. But I firmly believe that negotiations have been going on very steadily and are there. But the signals, become fairly clear that there's going to be some long-lasting results. That is, I don't think that all tariffs will go away, no matter what. I don't know if there will ever be something resembling NAFTA. I think the United States would be really, really stupid to have a baseline tariff on something as simple as potash. So your poor farmers can't afford the proper fertilizer they need. However, your economic outlook is really bleak as long as all the uncertainty remains. Like the biggest problem right now from all the tariffs is you have a level of uncertainty that's never existed for a long time. You think of what caused major economic uncertainty, like the Second World War. That's about the level of economic uncertainty Trump's tariff policies have created around the world. That the status quo in Canada, what is the economic effect? Well, it's really the uncertainty that he has created rather than the specific policies. It's just the straight uncertainty makes all major businesses just rein in. They're not going to make any new investments until things become clearer. There's greater certainty of what will happen or should happen.
Well, that's probably Trump's greatest threat. And he knows that. It's a bullying tactic. He wants uncertainty. He wants chaos so that the people in Canada, who he knows don't want chaos, don't want uncertainty, will appease him. And sure enough, I want to ask you at some point what people feel, but sure enough, it was only a day or two later that Mark Carney went to the Parliament in Ottawa and said, "Can you repeal or delay this digital services tax?" And they did. So what was his analysis, and what political influences was he operating under when he made that request to the Parliament?
He has his own way of dealing with a bully. And I will say that would be one of his tactics, is that particular excuse. If you eliminate the excuse of the weak, eventually Trump's subordinates will eventually, move the negotiations further along. In the end, American companies are going to pay the digital service tax, and they're going to pay it retroactively. That's the reality of the world. Anything else would be, stupid. And I don't think that, Trump cares two hoots about whether Jeff Bezos has to pay, a reasonable tax on the business he does in other countries.
What happens then? How do people feel about this? I mean, I tell you how I feel about it. I think he's facing him down and successfully. What about the guy in Ontario? How does he feel about it? Because he might be saying, "Hey, Mark, don't capitulate to this fellow. Don't appease him. When you have a bully like that, every time you accede to his demands, you are encouraging the next demand, the next excuse, and so forth." How do people feel about that? And were they saying to Mark Carney or the Parliament, "Don't do this. Don't go along"?
If you're to look at the fellow from Ontario, the premier is called Doug Ford. And the best way to measure, or to answer the question you just asked, is to look at what happened when Doug Ford said, as an immediate response to something Trump was doing, to say that they would have an export tax on all the electricity going to the United States. And Trump just went into an immediate flap and 2 hours later doubled all the tariffs on everything under the sun. Just sort of saying, I can outlast you type of thing. Okay, now, clearly the United States has less reliance on foreign trade than any country in the world, or any major country. And so the concept that the U.S. could get along with less trade than others, and clearly Trump is a believer that the U.S. public can afford to pay let's call it the lower echelons economically of the U.S. public can pay the taxes that the rich now pay. He's just, tariffs are just a way to shift the tax burden from the wealthy to the average citizen, with price increases. But, the collateral damage, or the real damage, is to the competitiveness or lack thereof of every industry in the United States. If you have a baseline tariff on every import coming into the United States, then everything is going to go up in cost.
So how does Doug Ford feel about this? Is he criticizing Mark Carney for capitulating? Is he criticizing the Parliament for repealing the tax? I mean, he's a strong figure, and I would have imagined that he would oppose repealing the tax, and he would want to stand fast against Trump's bullying.
On an IQ test, I think Ford and Trump might be equal. That is 90 minus, or whatever the measurement is, where 100's normal. Ford is, temperamental and strong personality, and used to getting his way, and Canada would not be better off to have him dealing with Trump. And in fact, generally everybody in Canada has asked him to shut up.
Okay, well, so that means he has opposed it, but people don't necessarily agree with his opposition to repealing the digital services tax.
That's right, but also the federal government has, with a little bit of experience, using, for example, the experience of Trump's response to Ford, was Mark Carney has announced retaliatory tariffs and we have a large number in place already. But the ones he's announced is saying if nothing changes 30 days from now, this tariff will go into effect. And that's how they've been dealing with the counter tariffs or counter policies. In the meantime, they're progressing very aggressively, a large number of countermeasures against the effect on the Canadian economy of the tariffs. The Canadian economy has taken somewhat of a hit. The actions taken so far have mitigated significantly that effect. The effect in Canada is very, very uneven. For example, the most prosperous province in Canada, Alberta, their gross domestic product has increased, at an annual rate of about 5% so far this year. That is, it's booming and going forward really fast. Now, part of that is, their biggest export, the biggest factor is oil, and the second biggest is natural gas, and the next largest are petroleum type products. And all of those have been going into the U.S. Tariff free, and the volume has been higher and the price has been higher.
What's going to happen going forward here? You touched on an interesting, discussion of how the price will change going forward. But how will these negotiations change going forward? Is this the kind of thing where Mark Carney would like to sort of slowball it and not come to any resolution? Because frankly, it's not at resolution now. It's in the press and everybody making rhetorical statements, and Mark Carney is being clever by not responding to Trump's insults and the like. But where does it go from here? Can Canada maintain without a settlement of these issues, without coming to a negotiated result, or will it begin to feel the noose tightening?
Time is on the United States' side. That is, Canada would prefer to have a quicker solution rather than a slower solution because Canada hurts in the meantime. But the Carney government, recognizing that in the long run, Canada is better off to allow the gradual pressures in the United States to push for and end up with a solution rather than Canada doing the Doug Ford type of scream and counter and try to have some quick action and therefore have the bully rubbing his hands saying, oh, goody, goody, I've got them where I want them.
The general rule would be is if somebody bullies you and you appease him, then he is going to be emboldened. And what I would worry about, and you have to tell me if you were worried about this or you worry that Mark Carney would worry about this, is that the repeal or the delay of the digital services tax will embolden Trump take a harder position in these negotiations that are supposedly happening or will happen, he won't be really very conciliatory because he'll see Carney and Canada as weak.
If this was a argument between two families, then I would agree with you. When you put it in the perspective of this is an economic issue, and Mark Carney is in it to do the best for the Canadian economy that he can do. And what he's doing, in my mind, is exactly what you need to do to deal with the bully. For example, I live in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, and there's two major economic things that have happened in the west coast in the last bit. A rate barely south of the Alaska Panhandle is a large inlet from the Pacific Ocean because a major river runs into the ocean at that point. and there's a bunch of deep water ports available in and around that inlet. And in the last few days, the first major LNG tanker has been shipped out of there. So last week, if I'm to use short term, the only place that you could sell Canadian natural gas was either in Canada or to the United States. Oh, suddenly we have a major place we're selling natural gas that we didn't sell yesterday. So how's the Canadian economy doing? Well, that's a step better. Now, then, just a couple months ago, we had a major export terminal in the Vancouver area that was selling, able to load tankers with oil. Well, all of the oil that used to go anywhere that way all went to California and Oregon and Washington state, just straight south of Vancouver. And suddenly, you have, close to 1 million barrels a day going to Japan, Korea, China, etc. Well, gee, what's that do for the Canadian economy? That's a pretty big scale export. Now, at the same time, you're sitting where Trump's policies are absolutely catastrophic to the automobile industry in, southern Ontario, Mexico, but I would assume, therefore, it's not any nicer in Detroit. He's created a bloody mess in Detroit. Now you've got steel and aluminum. They're not quite as pathetic, but pretty close. You're dealing with price problems and supply problems, particularly with aluminum, because the U.S. just doesn't have any way that they can produce enough aluminum for what's needed. So you really have, the Canadian economy is not even in a recession. The total of the Canadian economy, as I mentioned, the province of Alberta is booming. It's like, oh, these are great glory days. I mean, it's just chugging ahead like what tariffs? What problems? Whereas Southern Ontario and Quebec, where they have the steel and aluminum and automobile industries, they're really hurting. But the total economy is going to survive.
That's great to hear, Ken. It's great to hear. And it sounds like there are countermeasures in place and counter strategies that are working. And all this noise about digital services taxes and threats and name calling really is irrelevant if Canada can make it without having to accede to his bullying on a larger, wider scale. Anyway, there's much more to cover because this is an ongoing issue. We'll be back with, following it in all its complexity going forward. Thank you so much to our guest, Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. I'm Jay Fidell, host of View from the North, in this episode, which we are calling The Gap with Canada Widens. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Ken.
Bye for now from Canada.